He succeeded. Let that sink in for a moment. Orpheus actually did it. He walked into the kingdom of the dead, stood before Hades himself, and won. Death wept. The Furies, ancient spirits of vengeance who had tortured the damned for eons without a shred of mercy, cried real tears for the first time in eternity. Sisyphus stopped pushing his boulder. Tantalus forgot his thirst. Even Cerberus, the three-headed hound that had torn apart countless heroes, lay down peacefully and listened. And Hades, the grim lord of the Underworld, brother of Zeus, the one god who never bent his rules for anyone, broke his own most ancient law and gave Eurydice back to life. Orpheus won. Then, just 3 steps from sunlight, with victory literally within reach, he turned around and destroyed everything. But here's what the ancient poets knew. What makes this story cut deeper than a simple tale of love and loss. Maybe that backward glance wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was inevitable. Plato himself suggested something unsettling in his symposium, that Orpheus was a coward, that he never truly loved enough to die for Eurydice, and that the gods punished him by showing him only a phantom, an apparition of his wife that was never real at all. What if the greatest love story ever told was actually a story about fear, about doubt, about a man who achieved the impossible but couldn't quite believe it? Tonight, we descend the same path Orpheus walked, through gates that shouldn't open for the living, past rivers that poison gods, into halls where hope goes to die. And we'll discover something the ancient Greeks understood in their bones, that the cruelest tragedies aren't about failing to reach your goal. They're about getting exactly what you want, holding it in your trembling hands, and watching yourself destroy it through the very human weakness you can't quite overcome. Before his world shattered, Orpheus was extraordinary in ways we can barely imagine. The ancient sources from the 6th century BCE poet Ibycus to Ovid, writing around 8 CE, all agree on his fundamental nature, even as they disagree on details. When Orpheus played his lyre and sang, reality itself bent to accommodate him. This wasn't metaphor. The Greeks who first told these stories believed quite literally in music's transformative power. Trees would uproot themselves and walk closer to hear him, creating living groves wherever he performed. Rivers would stop flowing mid-current, their waters piling up in defiance of gravity, just to listen. Wild animals, predators and prey that should have been tearing each other apart, gathered peacefully together. Their evolutionary imperatives forgotten in the presence of something that touched them more deeply than hunger or fear. Even stones moved, rolling themselves into natural amphitheaters. Because in the Greek understanding of the cosmos, music was the audible expression of the mathematical principles that governed all existence. The Greeks didn't see music as entertainment. They saw it as cosmology made sound. The same harmonies that determined planetary orbits and seasonal cycles expressed through human voices and strings. A master musician like Orpheus wasn't performing. He was channeling the universe's fundamental order, making the invisible patterns that shaped reality temporarily visible through melody and rhythm. His parentage explains much, though here the sources diverge in revealing ways. Most traditions name his mother as Calliope, the eldest of the 9 muses, patron of epic poetry and eloquent speech. To be born of a muse meant having art woven into your very essence. Not a skill to be learned, but a birthright impossible to separate from your identity. His father remains disputed. Some sources, including the Greek geographer Pausanias, identify Oeagrus, a mortal king of Thrace, that wild northeastern region where Greek civilization blurred into something older and more primal. Thrace was where Dionysus held particular power, where ecstatic religion and shamanic practices flourished, where the line between human and divine grew dangerously thin. Others claim Apollo himself fathered Orpheus, making his music literally divine rather than merely divinely inspired. The difference between channeling heaven's harmonies and being heaven's direct voice on earth. What we can verify from multiple ancient sources, Orpheus received his lyre as a gift from Apollo, whether as father or patron, and mastered it with supernatural speed. The lyre itself held cosmic significance, its 7 strings corresponding to the 7 celestial spheres that Greeks believed surrounded the earth, each string tuned to produce the music that kept those spheres in motion. In Orpheus's hands, this sacred instrument transcended even its designed purpose. The earliest literary mention comes from Ibycus in the 6th century BCE. Just 2 Greek words surviving in fragments: famous Orpheus. The briefness tells us something crucial. By 530 BCE, Orpheus was already so renowned that poets could invoke his name without explanation, confident every listener would know immediately who and what they meant. The legend was already ancient. By the 5th century BCE, Pindar called him the father of songs in his poetry. Apollonius of Rhodes, writing his Argonautica in the 3rd century BCE, placed Orpheus among Jason's crew seeking the Golden Fleece, not as a warrior, but as something the quest needed even more than warriors. When the Argonauts faced the Sirens, those birdwomen whose irresistible song lured sailors to their deaths on the rocks, Orpheus didn't plug his crew's ears with wax as Odysseus would later do. Instead, he played his own music more beautifully than the sirens sang, drowning out their deadly voices with something even more compelling, even more impossible to resist. This reveals something profound about Greek concepts of power. Military strength mattered, certainly. The Argonauts needed Heracles for brute force challenges, but they also needed Orpheus, whose power operated on a different plane entirely. Music could accomplish what violence could not: create order from chaos, transform hatred into harmony, change hearts instead of merely subduing bodies. And it was this gift, this power to move the unmovable, that would eventually convince Orpheus he could achieve what no mortal had ever attempted: making death give back what it had taken. The ancient sources tell us remarkably little about how Orpheus met Eurydice, and even her name appears surprisingly late in the literary tradition. Plato and Euripides, writing in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, refer to Orpheus's quest to recover his wife, but never mention her by name. The poet Hermesianax in the 3rd century BCE called her Agriope. Not until the Lament for Bion, written sometime in the 1st century BCE, does Eurydice finally appear in surviving literature, more than 5 centuries, after Orpheus himself was first mentioned. This delayed naming might suggest something important. In the earliest versions of the myth, her individual identity mattered less than what her loss meant, less than what Orpheus's response revealed about love and grief and the boundaries between life and death. She was the beloved, rather than a specific person. Only as Greek culture evolved, as romantic love became more central to literature and philosophy, did she gain the name we now know. What we can piece together from Virgil's Georgics, 29 BCE, and Ovid's Metamorphoses, 8 CE, are most complete ancient sources. Eurydice was breathtakingly beautiful, either a nymph or a maiden, connected to wild places and growing things. She represented life's bloom, youth's promise, everything fresh and lovely and innocent in the world. Their wedding should have been the happiest day imaginable. The world's greatest musician marrying a woman whose beauty matched his talent. But from the very beginning, omens screamed that something was terribly wrong. Ovid describes the scene with ominous detail. Hymen, the god who presided over weddings and blessed unions, attended the ceremony as tradition required. But he gave no happy words. His expression remained grave, almost mournful. Most tellingly, the wedding torch he carried, which should have blazed bright, symbolizing the couple's passionate love and brilliant future, sputtered and smoked, filling everyone's eyes with tears, refusing to properly light no matter how much anyone shook it. These weren't subtle hints. The god responsible for blessing marriages was essentially announcing doom. yet they proceeded anyway. Perhaps they thought the omens misread. Perhaps love made them reckless. Perhaps happiness, when finally found, seems too precious to surrender even when the universe itself warns you it won't last. The exact circumstances of Eurydice's death shift between ancient authors, revealing how myths evolved to serve different narrative purposes. Virgil, writing in his Georgics, frames it around a shepherd named Aristaeus, son of Apollo. Aristaeus desired Eurydice and pursued her through the countryside with unwanted advances. Fleeing in terror, not watching where she ran, she stepped on a serpent concealed in the tall grass. The snake, startled and threatened, struck on pure instinct, its venomous fangs sinking into her heel. The poison worked terribly fast. No time for remedies, no chance for goodbyes. She collapsed among the flowers and died within moments. Her brief marriage ended before truly beginning. Ovid's version, presented in Metamorphoses Book 10, removes Aristaeus entirely. Eurydice wasn't fleeing assault. She was simply walking through meadows with her companion nymphs on what should have been a day of celebration. Perhaps dancing, perhaps gathering flowers, perhaps just enjoying the sunshine after her wedding. The setting is entirely peaceful, pastoral, innocent, which makes the serpent's strike even more cruel, even more random, even more representative of how death can arrive without warning or reason, destroying beauty for no purpose except that the universe sometimes works that way. Both accounts agree on the essential tragedy: a young bride, hours into her marriage, killed by a serpent in supreme irony. She who lived among growing things, who represented life's renewal, struck down by a creature that in Greek symbolism connected to chthonic powers, the dark earth and the realm of death below. The serpent wasn't simply an animal. It was death's agent, a reminder that Hades' kingdom extends its reach even into sunlit meadows where newlyweds dance. Virgil tells us that the nymphs who witnessed her death shrieked so loudly, their grief echoed through the mountains, from the peaks of Rhodope to distant rivers, nature itself mourning one of its own stolen away. But no amount of lamentation could draw poison from her veins, or breathe life into stilled lungs. For Orpheus, the loss defied comprehension. His grief wasn't measured sorrow, acknowledging death's inevitability. It was reality-shattering anguish. Virgil describes him wandering in absolute desolation for 7 months straight, refusing food, unable to sleep, his lyre producing only sounds of the most profound melancholy. His music, which once celebrated harmony and joy, now expressed nothing but pain. Animals still gathered to listen, but they came to mourn rather than celebrate. Trees still moved closer, but they seemed to droop with sorrow. Even stones wept, moisture seeping from their surfaces as if the earth itself shared his anguish. His song no longer brought harmony to the world. Instead, it expressed existence's fundamental disharmony, the terrible truth that beauty can be destroyed, love can be stolen, and no amount of talent or goodness protects you from loss. And in that grief, in that refusal to accept what couldn't be changed, Orpheus conceived a plan no mortal had seriously attempted before. If Eurydice couldn't return to the living world, he would descend to the world of the dead. And if his music had power to move mountains and rivers and stones, perhaps, just perhaps, it might move something even more intransigent, the iron hearts of death's rulers themselves. The decision to enter Hades while still alive required either supreme courage or complete madness, and Orpheus's grief likely made distinguishing between them impossible. The ancient Greeks understood death very differently than many modern religions do. For most people, regardless of how virtuously or viciously they'd lived, death meant descending to Hades, a vast, gloomy realm beneath the earth where millions of shades drifted in cheerless twilight, neither happy nor tormented, simply existing in diminished form for eternity. Only the exceptional few who'd greatly pleased the gods might reach the Elysian fields where something resembling joy remained possible. The truly wicked, went to Tartarus for eternal torture. But the overwhelming majority joined that vast, undifferentiated mass of shades, forgetting sunlight, losing most of what made them individual, becoming pale echoes of their former selves. Living mortals had no place there. The boundary between life and death was meant to be absolute, crossable only in one direction. A handful of heroes had ventured to the underworld while living, Heracles most famously, who descended as one of his 12 labors to capture Cerberus, the three-headed guardian hound. But Heracles was Zeus's son, possessed of superhuman strength and divine protection, and even he barely survived. Theseus attempted the descent and became trapped, requiring Heracles to rescue him. Odysseus visited the underworld's edge to consult the dead prophet Tiresias, but never actually crossed over, never penetrated deep into Hades' kingdom. What Orpheus proposed had no real precedent. The geography of the underworld varied somewhat depending on the source, but certain features appeared consistently enough to form a general map of Death's domain. The entrance lay somewhere at the western edge of the world, past the river Ocean that Greeks believed encircled all lands. Some traditions placed the gates at Cape Tanarum in southern Greece, others at Lake Avernus in Italy, a volcanic crater whose sulfurous fumes and dark waters seemed like hell's opening itself. Orpheus, carrying only his lyre and driven by grief that bordered on insanity, found his way to one of these entrances and began his descent through absolute darkness, through passages that had never seen sunlight, through air that tasted of stone and endings. The first barrier, the river Styx, winding 9 times around the underworld, forming a boundary separating the living from the dead. Its waters ran black and cold beyond any earthly cold, so poisonous they could kill even a god, so terrible that even the Olympians swore their most binding oaths upon the Styx, knowing any deity who broke such vows would face punishment more terrible than mortals could imagine. At the river's edge sat Charon, the ancient ferryman who transported the dead across. Charon was old beyond reckoning, more corpse than living being, his eyes holding the weariness of one who has witnessed countless millions pass through his care. He accepted only the properly buried dead as passengers, those with a coin placed in their mouth to pay his toll. The unburied wandered the near shore for 100 years before being allowed to cross. The living had absolutely no place in his boat. But when Orpheus began to play, Charon paused. The song spoke of loss and longing, of love refusing to accept separation, of grief too profound to contain in the living world. It wasn't joyful music. It was beautiful beyond description, touching something in the ancient ferryman's withered heart. Perhaps across eons, Charon remembered what love felt like. Perhaps the music simply bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to whatever soul remained in his decrepit frame. According to both Virgil and Ovid, Charon allowed Orpheus to board, and together they crossed the black waters of Styx, moving from the world of life toward the kingdom of death. On the far shore waited another guardian, Cerberus, the monstrous 3-headed hound whose duty was ensuring the dead stayed dead, that none escaped back to the upper world. Each of the beast's heads was larger than a man, teeth like daggers, eyes burning with infernal fire. The creature's very presence was meant to inspire absolute terror. Heroes who'd faced Cerberus described it as more frightening than any battle with mortal enemies. Not merely a guard dog, but a manifestation of death's finality, physical embodiment of the fact that what dies cannot return. Orpheus drew no sword. He had no weapon but music, and so music is what he offered. The lyre's notes filled the air, and the song spoke of things beyond the song. Hound's comprehension, love, and beauty, and loss, the upper world's warmth, and unbearable pain of separation from what you cherish most. Ovid and Virgil both describe the same miraculous result. All 3 of Cerberus's heads listened. The snarling ceased. The eyes that moments before burned with predatory hunger grew soft. the terrible beast lay down, heads resting on enormous paws, perhaps dreaming for the first time in its existence of things beyond guard duty and violence. Music accomplished what no hero's strength ever could, not by defeating Cerberus through force, but by making the hound temporarily forget its purpose. Past Cerberus, Orpheus entered Hades' true depths. He walked through fields of asphodel, the ghostly flowers sustaining shades in their diminished existence. He passed regions where newly dead wandered in confusion, not yet accepting their mortal lives had ended. He moved through a landscape of rivers. Acheron, the river of woe. Cocytus, the river of lamentation. Phlegethon, the river of fire. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters erased all memory of earthly life. And always as he walked, he played. The shades gathered, these pale echoes of humanity, drawn to something they could barely remember. Some reminder of beauty and passion lost when they died. Ovid describes the scene with devastating detail. The bloodless ghosts wept, though they lacked substance to produce actual tears. The famous dead paused in their eternal routines. Tantalus, forever reaching for water that retreated whenever he tried to drink, forgot his thirst. Ixion's wheel, spinning endlessly as punishment for his crimes, ground to a halt. The vultures eternally devouring Tydeus's liver paused their feeding. The daughters of Danos, condemned to fill leaky jars forever, set down their vessels. Even Sisyphus, doomed to roll his boulder up a hill only to watch it roll down again, sat upon his stone and simply listened. For the first time in eternity, the torment ceased, the punishments paused, the sufferings were forgotten. Because Orpheus's song spoke of something more powerful than any curse the gods could devise. Love refusing to accept death's separation. Devotion willing to venture into hell itself rather than surrender to loss. And even the damned, who'd forfeited all hope of joy, recognized something sacred in that music, something worth pausing their eternal agonies to hear. At Hades' heart, in a palace built from shadows and silence, sat the rulers of the dead. Hades, grim lord of this vast kingdom, and Persephone, his queen, who knew both the upper world's warmth and eternal night's cold. No mortal had ever stood before their thrones asking for anything, let alone demanding death's most fundamental law be suspended. But Orpheus had crossed rivers, passed guardians, and ventured into places where the living had no business walking. Now he stood before the ultimate authority over the dead, with nothing but music and grief. The ancient poets understood this scene's significance and gave Orpheus words worthy of the moment. Ovid's version, preserved in Metamorphoses Book 10, captures his speech most completely. If I am permitted to speak truth, setting aside deception, I have not come to see Tartarus's gloom, nor to bind Cerberus's 3 snake-wreathed necks. I come because of my wife, struck down by a viper's poison before she could live out her years. The honesty is disarming, not claiming to be a hero on a quest or warrior seeking glory, just a man whose wife died too soon. Then comes the argument's heart. I have tried to bear it. I won't deny I've made the effort, but love has conquered me. Love, a god well known in the world above. Whether he is known here as well, I cannot say, but I suspect he is. If the ancient story of how you stole Persephone is true, then you also were joined by love. This is brilliant rhetoric, reminding Hades that he too once took a beloved from the upper world, that he understands wanting someone so desperately you'll defy convention. Persephone sat beside her husband, and Orpheus was essentially appealing to her memory of being taken, of understanding both sides of this equation. His central request acknowledged death's ultimate sovereignty. By these places of fear, by this vast chaos and silence, reweave the unraveled thread of Eurydice's fate. All things are owed to you eventually. We delay a little while, sooner or later, but we all hasten to this one dwelling. We are all bound here. This is our final home. You hold the longest dominion over the human race. Eurydice too will be yours to command, when she has lived out her full span of years to ripeness. I ask her return as a gift, a favor. But if the fates deny me, if you cannot grant this, then I am resolved. I will not return either. You can delight in both our deaths." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of absolute commitment. If death won't release Eurydice, Orpheus would join her in death immediately, choosing voluntary extinction over life without her. The logic: death gets everyone eventually anyway. He was asking only for a temporary reprieve, a handful of years for Eurydice to complete her natural lifespan before returning as all mortals must. But more than words, his music made the difference. As he spoke, he played, fingers never leaving the lyre's strings. Melody underscored every phrase, giving emotional weight rhetoric alone could never achieve. The song expressed what words couldn't capture: his love's depth, his grief's vastness, his devotion's sincerity. Ovid tells us that for the first time, the Furies wept. These ancient goddesses of vengeance, spirits of retribution, whose job was punishing the guilty, whose hearts were harder than stone, whose very nature was pitiless pursuit of wrongdoers. They felt tears on their cheeks. They who'd witnessed every cruelty and crime, who'd seen humanity's worst, were moved by Orpheus's simple, honest, overwhelming love for his lost wife. Hades himself, the grim king who ruled countless millions with iron authority, who'd never shown mercy or weakness, sat motionless as music washed over him. Some sources suggest he too wept, though gods rarely displayed such vulnerability. Persephone certainly did, perhaps remembering her own mother's grief when Hades took her to the Underworld, perhaps recognizing in Eurydice's death an echo of her own separation from the living world. The silence when music ended must have been profound. Everything in the Underworld had stopped to listen. Torments remained paused. Shades stood motionless, waiting. Even time seemed stilled, holding its breath to see whether death's rulers would do what had never been done: release someone from their kingdom, return a soul to life, acknowledge that love might be stronger than mortality's absolute claim. Finally, according to both Virgil and Ovid, Hades spoke. The bargain's details varied slightly between authors, but the essential agreement remained: she could go. Death would release her. The impossible was being granted. But there was a condition, a single unbreakable rule Orpheus had to follow. A test proving whether his love was as absolute as his music claimed. Persephone, imposed the law according to Ovid. You may have her back. Eurydice may return to the upper world, but you must not look at her. You must walk ahead, and she will follow behind. Not once, as you ascend through darkness, through paths leading back to the living world, may you turn around to look at her. Only when you have both emerged completely into sunlight, when you've both left my kingdom entirely, will it be safe to look. If you turn before then, if you glance back even once, she will be lost forever. The gift will be withdrawn. This is my condition. Accept it or leave her here. Orpheus agreed immediately. How could he not? After achieving the impossible, after convincing death itself to release its grip, what choice did he have but to accept whatever terms were offered? Eurydice was summoned. Ovid tells us she came slowly, walking with a slight limp. Her heel still bore the serpent bite's mark, the wound that killed her. Some scholarly interpretations suggest she was confused, uncertain whether this was real or some cruel trick. She'd been among newly arrived shades, her death so recent, she still remembered sunlight, still mourned the life she'd lost. Now, here was her husband, somehow alive in this place of death, telling her they could go home. They began the ascent. Orpheus led, walking the upward-sloping path from Hades' palace toward the distant surface. Behind him, Eurydice followed, her footsteps silent as all shades' footsteps are, her presence more felt than heard. The way was dark, steep, shrouded in thick fog, making seeing impossible. The path twisted through caverns and passages existing in perpetual night. Every step took them farther from the underworld's depths and closer to the living world, but the journey was long and darkness absolute. Both Virgil and Ovid describe Orpheus's growing anxiety as they climbed. At first, he was simply relieved, grateful, focused entirely on putting one foot in front of another and getting them both to safety. But as the journey continued, as they walked through silence, broken only by his own breathing and footfalls, doubt crept in. He couldn't hear Eurydice behind him. Shades made no sound when walking. He couldn't feel her presence. The darkness was too complete. He couldn't be certain she was actually following. What if Hades had deceived him? What if this was a cruel joke? Eurydice never released at all. What if he walked alone through darkness, climbing toward the surface with no one behind, having sacrificed everything for nothing? The uncertainty gnawed with every step. All he had to do was glance back, just for a moment, just to confirm she was there. Surely that wouldn't violate the condition. Surely Hades meant only that he shouldn't embrace her or speak to her, not that he couldn't even verify her presence. But the condition had been clear. No looking back. Not once. Not for any reason. Not until both were completely in sunlight, both entirely free of the underworld's claim. Despite mounting anxiety, despite every instinct screaming to turn around and check, Orpheus kept climbing. He trusted. He had faith. He believed Hades, having granted this unprecedented mercy, wouldn't betray him now. The path grew steeper. Darkness seemed thicker, if possible, as if the underworld itself reluctantly released them. Orpheus's breathing grew labored. His legs ached, but he kept moving upward, kept trusting Eurydice followed silently behind. Then, suddenly, light. Faint at first, barely a suggestion of illumination penetrating the darkness ahead, but unmistakable. The entrance, the boundary between death and life. They were nearly there. Just a little. Farther. Just a few more steps. This was the most dangerous moment. Success was so close, so tantalizingly near, that fear of losing it became overwhelming. Virgil writes that sudden madness seized the unwary lover just as he reached the threshold. Ovid describes it as fear mixed with eagerness. Desperate desire to see his beloved, combined with mounting anxiety she might not actually be there. Here's where the sources provide slightly different accounts, though the result remains devastatingly the same. Some versions suggest Orpheus had actually already emerged into sunlight himself and turned thinking Eurydice had also crossed the threshold. Others claim he was still technically in the underworld, but so close to the surface he thought the rule no longer applied. Still others, and this interpretation cuts deepest, say he simply couldn't help himself, that the need to see her, to confirm she was real and present and following, overwhelmed every rational thought, according to Busi's, Ovid's account in Metamorphoses. And now, as he retraced his steps, he had avoided all mischance, and regained Eurydice was nearing the upper world, following behind. For that condition had Proserpine imposed. When a sudden frenzy seized Orpheus, unwary in his love, a frenzy meet for pardon, did hell know how to pardon? He halted, and on the very verge of light, unmindful, alas, and vanquished in purpose, on Eurydice, now regained, looked back. The moment their eyes met was both beautiful and terrible. She was there. She had been following all along. His doubt had been groundless. The journey was nearly complete. Nearly. Eurydice's expression in that split second before she began fading must have shown everything. Recognition, joy at seeing his face again, relief, the nightmare was ending, followed instantly by horror as she realized what he'd done, what his backward glance meant. Ovid gives her final words. What madness, Orpheus? What dreadful madness has brought disaster? Alike upon you and me, poor soul. See, again the cruel fates call me back, and sleep seals my swimming eyes. And now farewell. I am borne away, covered in night's vast pall, and stretching towards you strengthless hands. Yours, alas, no longer. Virgil's version in Georgics is similarly heartbreaking. What is this madness, she cries, that has undone both you, Orpheus, and myself, poor wretch that I am? See, the cruel fates summon me back again, and sleep buries my swimming eyes. Now farewell. I am taken by all-enveloping darkness as I reach my failing hands towards you. Ah, not yours now. She didn't reproach him, didn't rage at his failure, simply expressed sorrow at what might have been, what they'd lost in that moment of weakness. She reached with hands having no strength, existing only as shadow and memory. Then, like smoke dispersing into air, like a dream vanishing at waking, she disappeared. The underworld reclaimed her. Death reasserted its authority. The Shantis, unprecedented mercy was withdrawn. Orpheus stood at the threshold between life and death, sunlight warming his face, reaching desperately into darkness behind him for a wife no longer there. He'd been so close. Another step, perhaps two, and they would have been safe. But he had looked back, and in doing so, he'd lost her not once, but twice, and this time, he knew, would be the last. There would be no second chance. Death did not grant the same mercy twice. Orpheus tried to return. Both Virgil and Ovid tell us he rushed back down the path, desperately calling Eurydice's name, pleading for another opportunity, another chance to prove himself, to succeed where he'd failed. But Charon refused to ferry him across the Styx a second time. The ancient ferryman was unmoved by Orpheus's anguish, his music, his begging. Death had shown mercy once, bent its rules once, granted an exception, violating natural order. It would not do so again. The iron law had been reasserted. What dies stays. Dead. Orpheus had been given his chance and squandered it through his own weakness. Ovid reports that Orpheus sat on the river Styx's banks for 7 days in utter desolation, refusing food and water, filthy and disheveled, unable to process what had happened, unable to accept Eurydice was truly lost forever. He wept constantly, tears falling into dark waters, separating him from the wife he'd never see again. His music, when he could bear to play, was nothing but lamentation, grief given audible form, pain that couldn't be contained in silence. Eventually he returned to the living world, but the world he returned to was hollow, meaningless, empty of everything that once gave his life purpose. Virgil describes Orpheus wandering the frozen north, to places where ice never melted and darkness reigned for months, to Thrace's wildest regions and beyond, to the very edges of the known world, seeking the harshest, most inhospitable places, as if physical discomfort might somehow match or alleviate spiritual anguish. He refused all comfort, all companionship, all attempts by others to help him heal. According to Ovid, Orpheus avoided women entirely after losing Eurydice, either because his loss poisoned any possibility of romantic love, or because he simply couldn't bear forming attachments death might steal away. Some sources, including Ovid, suggest he turned instead to relationships with young men. Ovid states, Orpheus had abstained from the love of women, either because things ended badly for him, or because he had sworn to do so. His music changed fundamentally. Where once it celebrated beauty and harmony and life's pleasures, now it spoke only of loss and longing and existence's fundamental tragedy. He sang of Eurydice constantly, keeping her memory alive through art, even as her shade wandered the underworld in endless twilight. This transformation of Orpheus from celebrated musician to tragic mourner became, in ancient tradition, linked to a religious movement historians call Orphism. Mystery cults centered on Orpheus's teachings spread through Greece and beyond, offering initiates different understanding of death and afterlife than traditional Greek religion provided. Orphic theology emphasized the soul's immortality, reincarnation, the possibility of escaping birth and death cycles through proper ritual and moral living. The religion promised followers that death wasn't the end, that souls continued, that reunion with lost loved ones was possible in the afterlife for those who lived righteously. Whether a historical Orpheus actually founded this religion, or whether later adherents simply attached their doctrines to his famous name, remains debated by scholars. But the connection makes sense emotionally. Who better to explain death's mysteries than someone who'd actually visited the underworld and returned? Yet even Orphism's sophisticated theology couldn't protect Orpheus himself from a violent end. The manner of his death varies across ancient sources, but most traditions agree on its essential violence and connection to rejecting women or certain divine cults. According to Aeschylus's lost play, Basarides, known through later summaries, Orpheus met his end at the Maenads' hands, female followers of Dionysus, who worshipped through ecstatic dance and ritual frenzy. These women, inspired by wine and religious possession, tore Orpheus limb from limb. The motivation varied. Some said Dionysus ordered the attack because Orpheus rejected the god in favor of Apollo. Others claimed the Maenads killed him because he shunned female company after losing Eurydice, and their rejection by the world's greatest musician drove them to murderous rage. Ovid's account in Metamorphoses Book 11 describes the scene. Initially, Orpheus's music protected him even from the Maenads' fury. Their stones and weapons refused to strike him, falling harmless at his feet, charmed by his song. But the women's ritual drums and howling eventually drowned out his lyre, and once they could no longer hear his music's protective power, they attacked with whatever weapons they had: farming tools, ritual implements, their bare hands enhanced by divine frenzy. Orpheus, who'd never been a warrior, who'd faced every challenge with music rather than violence, had no defense. They tore him apart, scattering his limbs across the Thracian countryside. But even in death, even dismembered, Orpheus continued to sing. Both Virgil and Ovid describe his severed head, still somehow giving voice, floating down the river Hebrus along with his lyre, both still making music as they drifted toward the sea. Virgil writes, "And even when Oagrian Hebrus rolled in mid-current that head, severed from its marble neck, the disembodied voice and the tongue, now cold forever, called with departing breath on Eurydice. Ah, poor Eurydice. Eurydice the banks re-echoed all along the stream. The head sang Eurydice's name, refusing to be silenced even by violence and destruction." Eventually, according to multiple sources, including Lucian and Philostratus, the head and lyre washed ashore on the island of Lesbos, where locals treated them with great reverence. Some traditions claim the head became an oracle, speaking prophecies and giving divine guidance, its wisdom sought by pilgrims traveling from distant lands. The oracle grew so famous that Apollo himself eventually had to silence it, jealous that his own shrine at Delphi was being overshadowed. The Muses, Orpheus's divine relatives through his mother Calliope, gathered what remained of his scattered body and buried the pieces at the foot of Mount Olympus. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, mentions this tradition and notes that nightingales sang more beautifully there than anywhere else in Greece, their songs echoing Orpheus's music. Zeus, according to several sources including Ovid, took pity on the musician's tragic fate and placed his lyre in the Tzuz, heavens as the constellation Lyra, where it remains to this day, a reminder that true art transcends even death. And Orpheus's shade. Multiple sources, including Virgil and Georgics, suggest it finally found its way back to the underworld, retracing the path it had walked in life, searching through cheerless halls until it found Eurydice's shade among the millions. Virgil writes, "Sometimes Eurydice walks ahead and Orpheus follows, and sometimes Orpheus walks ahead, knowing that here she jute and death, he can at last look back at his Eurydice without fear. There, ta soul. In death, they were finally reunited, never to be separated again, walking together through asphodel fields, able at last to look at each other without fear or consequence, their love preserved in the only place where death couldn't touch it, death itself. Nearly 3,000 years after the earliest mentions of Orpheus, his story continues resonating with undiminished power. But what makes this particular myth so enduring? What truth does it capture that keeps each generation retelling it in new forms? Part of the answer lies in how perfectly the myth encapsulates grief's experience. Every human who's lost someone loved knows the desperate, irrational desire to undo that loss, to reverse time, to find some way, any way, to bring the beloved back. We know intellectually that death is final, that what's gone can not return, that the universe doesn't bend to our wishes, no matter how intensely we wish. But knowing intellectually and accepting emotionally are entirely different things. Orpheus embodies this universal experience. His descent to the underworld isn't historical or literal, but emotional and psychological, representing what every grieving person does. We go to dark places. We confront death's nature. We bargain and plead and try finding some loophole in mortality's iron laws. And we learn, as Orpheus learned, that some losses cannot be undone, no matter how much we love, how talented or devoted or desperate we are. The backward glance has become one of mythology's most analyzed moments. Why did he look back? The sources themselves can't quite agree, which suggests the ambiguity is essential to the story's power. Was it doubt, as some interpretations suggest? A failure of faith that Eurydice was actually following? Was it love, an overwhelming need to see her face, to confirm her presence, to share escape's joy? Was it fear something had gone wrong, that she'd stumbled or fallen behind? Or was it simply human nature? The impossibility of following an absolute prohibition when everything in you screams to violate it. Virgil describes the moment as sudden madness, seizing the unwary lover, adding a crucial phrase, "A frenzy meet for pardon, did hell know how to pardon?" This suggests sympathy for Orpheus's failure, understanding that the test was perhaps impossibly difficult, that asking someone to walk through darkness without verification, to trust completely, when doubt is so natural, might have been asking too much. But here's where Plato's interpretation, presented in the Symposium, offers a darker reading worth considering. Plato suggests the infernal gods presented an apparition of Eurydice to Orpheus, rather than actually giving her back. Plato's Orpheus is characterized as a coward who, instead of choosing to die to be with his beloved, mocked the gods by trying to go to Hades to bring her back alive. Since his love wasn't true, he didn't want to die for love. He was punished. First by giving him only the apparition of his former wife in the underworld, and then by being killed by women. This reading transforms the entire myth. What if Orpheus never could have succeeded? What if the backward glance was inevitable because what followed him wasn't real? What if the gods were testing not his faith, but exposing his cowardice, showing that he loved life more than he loved Eurydice? The ambiguity is the point. The story works. Whether Orpheus failed through human weakness, divine trickery, or predetermined fate, it works because it acknowledges that love and faith are hard. Trusting without seeing is hard. Following rules that seem arbitrary when they stand between you and your heart's desire is hard. The myth also speaks powerfully to the relationship between art and grief, between creation and loss. Orpheus was defined by his music, by his ability to make beauty, to create harmony from sounds, raw materials. But his greatest music, the songs that moved even death itself, came from his deepest pain. This suggests something important about art's nature and purpose. Beauty can emerge from tragedy. Pain can be transformed into something transcendent. Life's worst experiences can be alchemized into creations touching hearts across millennia. Every artist who's created from personal anguish, who's turned darkest experiences into art helping others navigate their own darkness, participates in Orpheus's legacy. The story has been reimagined countless times across centuries. Medieval poets transformed it into Sir Orfeo's tale, giving it a happy ending. Opera composers from Monteverdi, 1607, to Gluck, 1762, to Philip Glass, 1993, have set it to music, each finding new emotional depths. The 1959 film Black Orpheus transposed the setting to Carnival in Rio, proving the story works anywhere love and death intersect. The 2019 Broadway musical Hadestown reimagines the myth in a Depression-era setting, adding political and economic dimensions while preserving the emotional core. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects. Some focus on music's power, others center Eurydice's perspective, giving voice to a character who in ancient sources barely speaks. The fact that the myth supports all these interpretations speaks to its richness, its refusal to reduce to any single meaning. In our own time, the story resonates particularly powerfully, perhaps because we live in an age of declining religious certainty about what happens after death. The ancient Greeks had their underworld cosmology, their understanding of where souls went and what awaited them. Modern secular society often lacks that certainty. Death has become, if anything, even more frightening because we cannot quite believe in any definite afterlife, even as we desperately hope for one. Orpheus's journey offers a kind of template for processing that uncertainty. He went to death's kingdom and returned with knowledge, with experience, with testimony about what lies beyond life's boundary. That his mission ultimately failed doesn't diminish its significance. He proved love can take you to impossible places, that devotion can move even the unmovable, that grief has power beyond rational measurement. And if he couldn't quite bring Eurydice back, if human weakness sabotaged the attempt at the last moment, well, that feels honest, true to how life actually works. We fail more often than we succeed. Our best intentions collapse under pressure. Our love, however sincere, cannot ultimately protect those we cherish from death's claim. But we try anyway. We make the attempt. We sing our songs into the darkness. We descend to whatever underworlds our grief creates. And sometimes, just sometimes, we create beauty in the process that outlives us, that carries our love forward into future generations, that ensures the beloved is not forgotten, even if they cannot be recovered. As you drift towards sleep, let these final thoughts settle gently around you, like Orpheus's music drifting through the underworld's eternal halls. The myth doesn't give us easy answers or comfortable resolutions. It doesn't promise that love conquers all, or that devotion guarantees success. It offers something more valuable than false comfort: honest recognition of love's nature and loss's inevitability, along with the suggestion that how we respond to that loss matters deeply. Orpheus teaches us that grief is not shameful but sacred, that profound loss deserves profound response, that loving fully means risking devastating pain when what we love is taken away. He shows us that art can emerge from the darkest places, that beauty can be born from suffering, that music made from broken hearts can move even those who've forgotten how to feel. He demonstrates that attempting the impossible is sometimes necessary, that we must try even when success seems unlikely, that the journey itself has value even if the destination remains unreached. His descent was audacious, unprecedented, likely doomed from the start, but he went anyway, because love demanded it, because not trying would have meant accepting loss without resistance. Yes, he failed. His backward glance cost him everything. But consider what that failure reveals. Being human means being imperfect. Our nature includes doubt and fear alongside love and devotion. We carry weakness within us, even when we need to be strong. The myth doesn't condemn Orpheus for his failure. It simply acknowledges this is how we are, how we've always been, beautiful and broken and unable to trust completely, even when everything depends on it. The ancient Greeks understood something we sometimes forget. Tragedy can be beautiful. Sad stories can be valuable. Myths without happy endings serve important purposes. We need narratives acknowledging life's hardness alongside its loveliness, refusing to pretend everything works out, sitting with us in our grief rather than rushing to assure us it will all be okay. Orpheus's story sits with us. It says, I know love hurts. I know death takes what we cherish. I know we fail even trying our hardest. And it's okay to feel that pain. Acknowledge that loss. Admit that failure. The grief is real. The love was real. The attempt mattered even though it didn't succeed. So sleep now, carrying these ancient truths into your dreams. Remember that your love for others, however it ends, has value beyond measurement. Remember that your grief, when it comes, deserves to be honored. Remember that attempting the impossible is sometimes the most human thing we can do. And remember Orpheus, whose music still echoes across millennia, whose love still moves hearts, whose backward glance still breaks ours. His lyre hangs in the heavens as constellation Lyra. His shade found Eurydice in death's kingdom. His songs taught generations about beauty and loss and the terrible, tender courage it takes to love fully in a world where death waits for everything. Rest well, knowing that even stories ending in failure can contain truth and beauty. Even myths about loss can be gifts. Even songs born from grief can heal. The lyre is silent now. The path is walked, and somewhere in the darkness, two shades walk together, united at last, their love preserved in the only place it could survive, beyond death's reach, in story and song, in memory and myth, forever. Good night.